Thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to welcome Daphna Reshuk as a part of the Productivity During Pandemic series. Daphna will be speaking to us about Ukrainian sex workers' politics in changing times. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the land where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship of indigenous people to this land. Daphna is a third-year PhD student in anthropology at Indiana University, Bloomington. Her interests lie at the intersections of medical, political, and feminist anthropology. Her PhD project explores how the transformation of the public health system, with a particular focus on HIV provision, in Ukraine impacted vulnerable groups like sex workers. She holds a BA in Cultural Studies from the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy and an MA Anthropology from the University of Alberta. Her work appeared in the journals Anthropologica and Economic Anthropology. Thank you for joining us, Daphna. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Supriya. And I would like really to start by thanking the Spark Center, the McMaster University, and also Professor Alison Van for inviting me here today. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to be here and to share some of my thoughts today with you and some of my ideas. So if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen. I hope that you can see it now.
Yep, that's a go.
Awesome. So my talk will be about sex work in Ukraine. I will start by briefly introducing the topic and the context, and then I will follow with some thoughts and ideas about the informality, intimacy, and authenticity that my research has led me to. And I will finish my talk today by discussing some of the effects of the current pandemic on sex workers in Ukraine. So let's start with the context. So the data that I will draw on in this talk today comes from my field work in Ukraine in spring and summer 2017 and summer 2019. Hopefully, pandemic permitting, I will be able to go back to Ukraine for a longer time to continue with my research. And but so far, well, I have what I have, unfortunately. So I conducted research in central Ukraine in the city of Kropyvnytsky. And you can see that it's a city in central Ukraine, and it is not a very big city. It is a city of around 200,000 inhabitants, and also the capital of the district of Kirovohrad district. In the USSR, Kropyvnytsky was an industrial city. It had developed mechanical engineering and manufacturing industries, but since the perestroika times, that is, since the late 1980s, the city has been losing its significance and experiencing deindustrialization, which also resulted into high unemployment rate and increasing poverty. And most of my participants were from the city, but also some of the participants were from the neighboring city of Kryvyi Rih. And Kryvyi Rih is located in the Dnipropetrovsk region, which is some, 130 kilometers southeast from Kropyvnytsky. And Kryvyi Rih is a more populous and a more well-off industrial city than Kropyvnytsky, as it managed to preserve more of its industry. So all sex workers with whom I did my research were women who tailored to heterosexual men. The majority was in their early to mid-20s, and the oldest woman was around 50. Also, all of them had at least one child, and most women gave birth at an early age, in their late teens or early 20s. Most of my participants also had a substance use disorder. Some sex workers were married or in a long-term relationship, while others were divorced and didn't currently have a partner. Also, none of my participants had higher education. Some of them had full secondary education, whereas some didn't even finish high school. And though some became sex workers in order to pay for drugs or alcohol, the majority of my participants entered sex work because they couldn't really find other employment that would bring them at least some economic stability. And you may have question now as to why I'm mentioning, like, why am I powering all this data over you now? But I'm mentioning this because quite often there is a tendency, at least in Ukrainian media or general public discussions of sex work, to homogenize or sensationalize sex work. So I feel that it is important to stress that there are internal differences even within the group of mostly street sex workers with whom I hanged out. So off to the legal context. So in Ukraine, sex work is not a criminal activity per se. It's rather considered an administrative offense. And Article 181.1 of the Code of Ukraine on Administrative Offenses specifies that the activity of prostitution, as it is framed in the code, is punishable by a warning or a fine. However, in Ukraine, it is a criminal offense to manage a brothel or to engage in sutenierstvo, meaning to procure clients. That's organized sex work, so to say, is criminalized. And the Articles 302 and 303 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine basically specify that these activities are punishable by a fine or imprisonment. And my participants, they often claim that these articles really precluded them from working together, from hiring security, because both sex workers and security then can be charged with organized sex work, with sutenierstvo or with managing a brothel. And just to illustrate my participants' dislike of the legal context of sex work in Ukraine, I chose to illustrate it with this photo. And as you can see on the slide, you can see the head of a local sex workers self-organization together with a guy who is a human rights activist, and they are holding a poster together that says in Ukrainian that sex workers are not criminals and stop making us sign protocols. And basically this refers to the practice of police officers making sex workers sign administrative protocols, confessing basically to engagement in sex work, so that police officers then may, when the need arises, backdate the protocols in order to meet a monthly or a quartile quota. So in addition to not being legal, sex work in Ukraine, and I bet it is not specific to Ukraine in this case, is also often infused with various moral questions. And quite frequently one can hear in Ukraine that question of sex work is being attached to the issue of religion, often bringing up the so-called traditional, in that context, Christian values. And that sex work ends up often being framed through the references to morality, sin, and also the need to salvage women in prostitution. Alternatively, sex work in Ukrainian formal political discourse is often framed through the concept of European values and a linear narrative of Ukrainian progress from the Soviet past to the bright European and Western future. And according to this narrative, sex work has to be legalized. And sex workers quite often oppose both of these positions. And as quoted in the title of my talk, according to sex workers, ideally politicians and journalists should not discuss the matter of sex work without prior consultation with a member of the community. Hence, nothing about us without us. And I chose to illustrate this with a photo of one of the sex workers activists from this year Women's March in my hometown of Kiev, Ukraine. And Women's March, it is an annual event that is usually held for women's rights, and it takes place on the International Women's Day, that is March 8th. And so this is a photo from this year's Women's March, and this sex worker activist, she's holding a banner with a slogan that says basically, fudge your morality. And in this social and legal climate, it is often unsurprising that sex workers sometimes they feel the need to legitimize their income generating activity. And though there is a variety of ways that they do it, in this talk, I will focus on the two main ways. First, how they try to legitimize sex work by employing various small-scale political tactics, and secondly, how they try to legitimize sex work by pragmatically presenting sex work to the outsider as an emotionally disengaged activity in order to stress basically that it is only work. And even though that such a view of sex work might quite often contrast with their own views of sex work. So I have argued elsewhere that Ukrainian sex workers employ a variety of infra-political tactics, and I'm borrowing this term from political anthropologist James Scott. And also, sex workers engage in a variety of what political scientist Michael Hanchard calls coagulate politics. And I will provide an example now. So one of the important political strategies that sex workers employ is raising HIV awareness. According to one sex worker, Asya, it has been an eye-opener for her to learn that many people in her native city think that HIV can be transmitted by sharing a cup or a spoon with an infected person. Shocked by public ignorance with regard to such questions, she told me that she plans to go to the local Department of Education and ask that she and her fellow colleagues are allowed to organize public lectures in schools and colleges in order to counter public myths and misunderstandings about such diseases as HIV, human papillomavirus, or hepatitis. And so, as you said to me, and I quote, and you can also see this quote on the slide. For instance, in my school where my children go, people trust me. So if Aunt Asa comes and explains everything, and I think it's very telling that she didn't even feel the need to really finish the sentence, because the way she was talking about it, it conveyed quite a degree of certainty that school officials trust her and that she will face no obstacles in organizing these talks in the school that her children go to, for instance. Importantly, though, in her public activities, Asa does not really mention that she was a sex worker herself and that now she works in the organization that advocates for sex workers' rights. Instead, Asa tells outsiders that she works for a human rights organization. And in this way, Asa safeguards her children and herself from being targeted with negative stereotypes and from being bullied, and establishes herself as a legitimate subject in the eyes of the public. And working in the sphere of human rights in Ukraine is really considered to be a prestigious and important activity, unlike working for an organization that advocates for sex workers' rights. And according to Asya, it is not only sex workers who need to be educated about different sexually transmitted infections, but the general public as well. However, a lot of sex workers' political activism is focused first and foremost on educating their fellow sex workers. This happens predominantly due to two reasons. Firstly, because of the nature of their work, sex workers are at a greater risk of having a sexually transmitted infection if they do not know how to protect themselves. Secondly, they are easier to reach, and also they seem to be genuinely interested in learning how to protect themselves. And educational activities such as raising HIV awareness, negotiating with friendly gynecologists for checkups, and also organizing lectures by friendly gynecologists about reproductive health, all these things, they serve to make sex workers more knowledgeable about the risks that they face, also raise awareness about their activism, and also to recruit new members. As Michael Hanchard notes, coagulate politics often involves people, I'm quoting, who are in conflict and competition over goods, services, and resources. Thus, end quote, I interpret sex workers' activism that aims to reduce competition among sex workers and to help them develop some common ground, or even to develop a shared standpoint that can be, in case of need, transformed into an explicit political position that can be easily communicated to public. I interpret this type of activism as an example of coagulate politics. According to Hanchard, also, coagulate politics fit in between the level of the micro and the macro politics. Coagulate politics, in other words, I quote, take place within public spheres and work sites in full view of superordinates, but are largely contingent upon the encounters between subaltern members divided by the conditions of labor, but united by a perceived commonality of subordination, end quote. So, as you can see, Hanchard's concept of coagulate politics is really quite useful in considering the efforts that my participants invest in self-organization and discursive normalization of sex work, despite being marginalized and vulnerable beings who are quite often forced to compete among themselves for various resources and also to compete among themselves for clients. And speaking about discursive normalization of sex work, I feel that another example is due. So when sex workers talk about their experience of sex work, they usually attempt to frame sex work as first and foremost just work, as a means to earn money, and to stress that their working identities and activities are drastically different from what they do and who they are in private. For instance, Natalia, when talking to the media about her experience of sex work and her activism, often reiterates the phrases like, and I'm quoting, "We do not sell our bodies, we offer services," and "Singers work with their throats, dancers work with their legs, we work with other parts of our bodies," end quote. I suggest that really Natalia's way of describing sex work she makes it intentional to balance on the verge of the obscene, and thus to add humor. And also, I think that this phrase is intended to work as an icebreaker in order to humanize sex workers and to render them less strange and exotic in the eyes of the public. And similarly, Arena, another sex worker activist, when I asked her about the purpose of their organization, she told me that they aim to make sex work a usual work, like a hairdresser's job, or a manicurist, or a salesman. Well, we just want it to be treated as a job and to put an end to discrimination. And based on other interviews and conversations as well, it seems that comparing sex work with other service or entertainment jobs is a political strategy for sex workers. They insist that what they do is offering services and that there is really no need to discriminate against this kind of job. Another important way for sex workers to discursively legitimize and normalize sex work is to push back against the idea of sex work as being somehow inauthentic. When discussing their bodies, sex workers often talked about them as resources, and when discussing encounters with clients, they also emphasized agency, supply and demand rhetoric, and also contract-like obligations that stem from their agreements with clients. And paradoxically, however, for sex workers, the fact that sex work was primarily an economic activity, it did not really diminish the degree of authenticity of experience that they shared with some of their clients. In other words, for many of them, sex for money was as authentic and honest as a gift kind of exchange that happens during one-night stands or within monogamous relationships. Sex workers often noted that they are honest with their clients, or as honest as they could be, and that they also came to care about certain quirks of some of their regular clients. For instance, it was quite common for sex workers to contrast themselves with women who go to bars or various cafes in order to hook up with men. And when I was talking with Ilona about a terminological dispute of prostitution versus sex work, she spoke really favorably of the term sex work, and she backed up her claims by contrasting herself, a sex worker, with women who hook up with men in bars and exchange sex for alcohol or money or other boons. So she said, and as you can see, it is a very long quote. "Well, I want to tell you that yes, every woman that comes to a bar is selling herself. When she comes to a bar to meet a guy, she does it for something, and not because she wants just to sit around him, chat with him when he buys her drinks. Well, it is all good, but what do we have in the end? You live with him, you go to his place, have sex with him, give him a blowjob for what? For a glass of beer, forgive me, or for 300 grams of vodka? You sold yourself, we can say so, without knowing it. Well, knowingly, but how do I explain it to you? It is something totally different. Someone can buy you a glass of juice instead of alcohol, but you will still live with him and have sex. And here in sex work, you have a price. You come, you have a price, and people have to pay to you this price. And in those situations, it is negotiable. They pretend it is because of love. Yes, a one-night stand because of love. And the majority of women does it. You can go to any bar and look at the girls how they dress up, and in different way hint that they are sexually available. And an emphasis on the contractual and transactional side of sex work was also quite pronounced in the story of Nelia, who is often referred to by other sex workers as a veteran because of more than 2 decades of experience of sex work. And basically, once Nella was describing this encounter with a truck driver and on a highway, and she described it in the following terms. A truck driver slowed down near me and offered me 100 rubles, meaning Ukrainian hryvnias, for a blowjob. I told him to fudge off. He told me that I disappointed him and that he wouldn't come here for me again. I told him, thanks God, I'm not doing that for 100. If he thought that I would beg him, he was wrong. I'm working here. I'm not giving alms. And as seen from Ilana's quotation above, and as you can see from Nella's quotation here, sex work for her is more honest and transparent activity, for instance, than one-night stands, as in a sex worker-client relationship, both parties agree on a price and services beforehand. However, sex work was also described as an honest activity in general, and most vehement declaration of sex work as an honest activity were often made by sex workers when I inquired whether their children or whether their relatives really know that they were or that they are sex workers. For instance, when discussing why her children know that she is a sex worker, Marina said that since she is a parent, she demands total honesty from her children. She is compelled to be honest with them in return and to provide them with truth about her work. Nevertheless, she cautioned, I quote, parents are parents, and it is not important how they earn money. I don't kill anyone. I don't steal. That is the main thing. I honestly earn this money. By what means I earn them? It is another question. It is the question that only I can pose to myself. Yes, only I can pose it and only to myself. And I just want to stress here that Marina was by no means the only one to insist on sex work as an honest way of earning money. Ksenia, who had her children taken away from her because of her substance use disorder, told me that she's really not hiding the fact that she's a sex worker from anyone in the neighborhood. And basically, she told me it in the following terms. I am not hiding it from anyone in my neighborhood. I don't care what they say. At least I am always looking them in the eye and saying, you're not going to provide for me, right? At least I'm working. I don't steal. I don't kill. I earn my money honestly, even if I earn it in such a way. And highlighting that sex work is primarily an economic activity, even if illegal, and contrasting it with theft and murder, I suggest that Marina and Ksenia attempt to point to a mismatch between illegality and illicitness and create a continuum of illegality and stress that certain activities, they may be either less illegal than others, or some activities may still be illicit even though they are illegal. Framing themselves as economic actors and attempting to divorce sex work from morality and to stress instead the exchange part of it, Ukrainian sex workers strive to position themselves as economic actors who willingly engage into transactional relationships with their clients. In other words, with the help of their narratives of honesty and sex work as a usual work, they shift the focus from what is being exchanged to how it is done, whether the transaction was honest and fair, licit or illicit, and whether all parties were clear about their roles. And this rhetoric can also be read as indexical to the shift to a neoliberal order as an attempt to create entrepreneurial subjectivity. And I'm not denying that, and I'm being wary of the dangers of atomization and individuation that usually come along with it. However, I suggest that this rhetoric can also be read as a story of agency, a story of women who are trying to make the best of their situation while being constrained by various discourses of morality and authenticity. So sex workers' organization and development of support networks, all those practices of coagulate politics that I have mentioned earlier, they have become really useful when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. A lot of outreach organizations that have been providing sex workers with express HIV tests and condoms noted that both the number of calls to their organizations and the number of people that they see during their visits to various spots where sex workers usually work, that basically the number of people they see sharply declined. And because of the decrease in the number of clients, many sex workers did not did not have work and thus lost the main source of their income. Some sex workers managed to keep their regular customers. However, this was not the case. This has not been the case for all sex workers. And as you can see on the slide, COVID-19 has worsened the situation for sex workers, not just in Ukraine, but in many other places as well. And I intentionally chose these quotes from sex workers organization in Latin America and also from sex workers in Congo that the Global Network of Sex Workers Project collected, because I wanted basically to allude to various similarities in the struggles of sex workers globally. Though there has been some talk in primarily Western Europe and North America about sex workers transitioning online, this has not really been the case for my participants. Because street sex work often attracts women who are vulnerable, and primarily because of their socioeconomic position or their health issues, it was rather difficult for this category to move online. For instance, because of the loss of income, many sex workers were forced to pawn their valuables, and many thus pawned even their smartphones, and their phone is usually the main device that they use for internet access in their household. In addition, a lot of street sex workers with whom I did my research, they lack internet literacy, which precludes them from successfully moving to online. In brief, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the differences within sex work sharper and more pronounced. A self-organization of sex workers that grew out of the coagulate politics that I mentioned earlier has been especially active during the COVID-19 pandemic. The organization has intensively fundraised in order to be able to provide financial aid to sex workers who contacted it, and in order to provide financial aid to sex workers who have been in touch with the organization before COVID hit. In particular, the organization has actively supported fellow sex workers by providing them with groceries, intimate hygiene products, and also diapers and baby food, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of sex workers are mothers and some of them are also single mothers. And also the organization was providing sex workers with masks, gloves, and hand sanitizers. And finally, it also supported sex workers' access to a series of medical services. For instance, if a sex worker wanted to enroll in the program offering opioid substitution therapy, and also it provided sex workers with various social services like help to deal with intimate partner violence. Overall, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the issue of decriminalization of sex work more prominent and urgent for sex workers community. The pandemic has also affected the claims made by the sex workers community. It made the community to articulate broader claims and demands to the state. Instead of focusing more narrowly on the issues pertaining just to sex work, the sex workers community now articulates claims that are also relevant to homeless people, people of low socioeconomic status, those who live with HIV, those who have substance use disorders, by, for instance, demanding more inclusive and better access to healthcare, and also demanding social housing. And I want to finish this talk by taking us back to sex workers' political practices. Quite often, when we are asked to think about politics and political practice, we immediately think of protests and of formal political participation like voting. However, quite often intervening into public space in the form of a protest is not really available for groups like sex workers who lack legitimacy in the eyes of the public. However, this doesn't really mean that these groups are apolitical. As I have suggested in my paper and in this talk, these groups, vulnerable groups like sex workers, they often resort to small-scale political practices that James Scott, for instance, calls infrapolitics, and what Michael Hunchard calls coagulate politics. In other words, the politics of marginalized groups like sex workers, I think it teaches us to rethink and broaden our definition of politics, and also probe once again the limits of political possibility. And on this note, I wanted to finish my talk and to say thank you for hanging here with me on a Friday morning, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. I have I have two claps for you. So thank you so much. I was looking to see if any of the participants had any questions. Do feel free to either unmute yourself or type it in the chat box, and I can read it out for Daphna. Going forward, what would you like to see happen regarding the law surrounding sex work?
That's a very good question. As I mentioned, in Ukraine, the situation is complicated because there are both criminal responsibilities attached to some of the a way to organize sex work, and also there is administrative responsibility. And basically, like for my participants, one of the main issues, one of the main goals for their organization now is basically to make sure that any references of sex work, they are removed from the code on the administrative offense. So it is kind of like number one priority, and I really support them in this because I don't think that they have basically to be punished for engaging into this income generating activity. It is more tricky with those criminal code articles because I don't think that they will totally go, but I think that some change into how they are formulated, basically, some change is necessary. And also, I haven't really mentioned this because this haven't been the focus, but also in the criminal code of Ukraine, there is a very odd and a very it's a very odd article, but basically it criminalizes HIV transmission, and basically this is also the article that is sometimes used to persecute sex workers, and it goes without saying that article from the criminal code also just it has to go.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Actually, I've never thought about that being illegal. But I have a question for you. What are the current, if you're aware of this, what are like the current laws in Canada and the states? You're in the states right now, and near Bloomington University, right?
Yeah.
So how does that work in the states? Because I know things are so different in the states than they are in Canada.
Right. So to the best of my knowledge, in the states, it really depends. It is different in different states. The short answer is, in Nevada, in the state of Nevada, there are a few counties where sex work is legal and where you can like legally go to a brothel and to get some services. But in the majority of the states, sex work is illegal. But it's not really my area of expertise, so I don't want to really to get into details and to
That's fair.
And to misinform you. But I mean, like how exactly it is illegal, it may depend on the particular state. There have been some great initiatives, though, to decriminalize sex work in the United States, and I fully support it.
Yeah, that's actually what my next question was going to be. Is so I'm guessing it is criminalized in some states then. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh, I have another one. Obviously, it's very complicated. I wrote an essay a long time ago on this, but the legal models usually surround which aspects? Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
I would be really glad if you decide to share that essay with me. I would be really interested in reading it.
Daphna, what is, I guess, is it all right if I oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say I can't type fast enough. All I know is like from what I remember, there's like the Nordic model where it's like it's illegal to sell sex, but it's legal to buy it. And then there's the alternate model, which I can't remember the name of. And like I remember in Canada, like the laws changed since I wrote the essay, but there was the whole issue of like soliciting sex publicly was illegal, but then when it came to like being an escort online, that kind of flew under the radar. And then there was the whole discussion about the people who actually rely on sex work as like a means to live, were the ones who are basically like being threatened because they're engaging in like the most dangerous form of sex work. And then like there's the I think it's the Swedish model. I don't know if I'm saying that right, where it's like completely legalized, not just decriminalized, but legalized. And like, you have the red light district and the government like basically like governs that.
Sorry, just Swedish model and Nordic model, they're basically one and the same. And it's one when basically it is prohibited to buy sex, but the selling of the sex is permitted. And it's, I think like Swedish was the first country to implement it in 1999 or somewhere around that time. And since then, I think it was like Norway, Iceland, Ireland, and France, and I think also Canada at some point, who joined this model. Then there is also what is sometimes referred to as the Dutch model, but basically legalization of sex work. But how sex work is legalized on the ground, it's often like different from one country to another, but quite often as in the Netherlands, basically legalization presupposes creation of these red light districts, as you have rightly mentioned. So basically it stipulates that, well, this is what you can do. You have to get a license in order to do it, and this is a place for you to do it. And also there is New Zealand, which decriminalized sex work, I think in the early 2000s. Correct me if I'm wrong. And quite often it is this example of New Zealand that, for instance, like my participants are often looking to. They say that like we don't really want sex work to be legalized because we don't want a lot of intervention from the state into like how we do what we do, but we just basically want to stop being illegalized. We just want to stop like working in this kind of shadow zone.
Yeah, obviously it's super complicated. I remember there was like two sides during I think it was like the Bedford case. I was trying to find my notes, and the Bedford case was a long time ago now, and like it was like a precedential case in prostitution in Canada. But they're saying like, oh, if you legalize it, then the government can tax it, and then the government can get their cut also, versus decriminalization where there's still some type of regulation, but the government doesn't get a cut on it. But then they were saying like, look, if you legalize it, then the government has to take some type of responsibility, because then what you're going to end up seeing is like the most vulnerable people in society, turning to this profession, and it's just going to uncover like a mess of a social issue that the government is actually responsible for. So yeah, obviously a huge topic to tackle and a very complicated thing to talk about. So kudos. It was a good talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another comment. Can you please speak more to the things that are adjacent to sex work that can impact the provision of sex work? For example, in the US, new legislation on trafficking has the effect of criminalizing sex work more steeply than in the past. Are there other examples of things in Ukraine that criminalize sex work indirectly?
Yes, sure. I have mentioned this really weird article about that criminalizes like known HIV transmission, that basically also like indirectly criminalizes sex work. But also trafficking, yes, it is a huge issue. I really didn't want to go there in this talk because it's a very big topic on its own, right? That just needs, I don't know, like another 1 or 2 hours to be tackled in depth. But yes, of course, trafficking is it's criminalized in Ukraine, and quite often, too often for my taste, when you start discussing sex work in Ukraine, the opponents, then they run into the issue of trafficking, and they say that basically if you decriminalize sex work, you're decriminalizing trafficking. And unfortunately, quite often like people they mix too, so kind of like the two activities, they become indistinguishable. And it really also didn't help that Ukraine along with other Eastern European countries. They are often heralded as the source countries for many women who are being like trafficked to the brothels of Western Europe and North America. And there is this myth and this legend that like, well, yeah, a lot of girls from Ukraine, they go abroad and they become and they are trafficked abroad and they become sexual slaves and they become pawns in these like global capitalist systems. And I don't want to deny that human trafficking is a horrible issue, but I think that when it comes to Ukraine, there are like a lot of myths surrounding this issue, and also the issue is the issue of trafficking. It often like gets misrepresented.
Definitely, thank you for that. I'm so sorry. This was a great talk, and I didn't mean to pull it into the weeds. I was using trafficking as an example. I was actually thinking of things like loitering laws sometimes can impact the provision of sex work. And so maybe not necessarily trafficking, but although that was a great response to that question, other things that we maybe don't directly associate with sex work that are criminalized. So in the way that sometimes, like in the UK, homelessness can be criminalized in that like loitering laws or like physical barriers are created on private property or even public property that limit people from like sleeping on benches, right? Are there ways in which like these kind of structural dimensions of daily life in Ukraine can inhibit sex work in unexpected ways, even if they're not explicitly oriented towards sex work? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm articulating myself well.
Sure. Thank you so much for clarifying it. Mm-hmm. Just one second, just to formulate it. So basically, I would say that how sex work is regulated in the US and how it is regulated in Ukraine, it's very different, right? So like in the US, we have this abundance of various like soliciting laws, and you have these signs of like no soliciting and other stuff, which can be sometimes used to tackle sex workers, for instance, right? And it's very different. It's very, very different in Ukraine because, well, if you're a homeless, you're not like criminalized. You're not really criminalized per se. Yes, the police can chase you away if you're like sleeping on a bench in the city center, but it's not really criminalized. So like the situation with homelessness in the US or in the UK, for instance, is quite different from how it is in Ukraine. So there are not so many like provisions that are kind of like indirectly related to regulating or to penalizing sex work. So that's why mainly like my participant sex workers, they are focusing on these on these administrative code, right? And on that 181 article that basically tackles sex work directly, because there are a few of those indirect things like trafficking, like those criminalizing HIV transmission, but really not so many. No, thank you for a wonderful question.
Thank you so much. I'm just quickly giving anybody else who is typing time. Otherwise, I think that was a very interesting question, because I didn't realize that I know this is not completely related to your talk, but homelessness being criminalized is the same as, sex work being criminalized as well. And oftentimes I guess that does go hand in hand. But oh man, what weird times we live in.
Well, I think they were getting to the idea that it could be decriminalized, but there could be the aspects around it that are still criminalized.
Yeah.
So like soliciting. But I think, I mean, like, it's not a topic that I know enough about, but like ultimately the government does want to like slow down the practice? Is that their ultimate goal? You know what I mean? Like, if they decriminalize prostitution, but then they make it illegal, like they criminalize the Johns, but they don't criminalize the prostitutes, like they don't criminalize the sex workers, then you're still ultimately trying to cease the activity, which, at least in Canada, I know that was like at one point the case.
I think
it's complicated.
It is complicated, and I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that a lot of it is unsafe for the workers, and they are interested in getting educated. But yes, sticky. There's a lot of elements at play here.
So Daphna, knowing what you know now and based on all your research, what direction do you want to take your research, and what questions have you come up with now that you want to pursue and answer?
Well, I want to just change the direction of my research a little bit, and I want to focus. I want to take more of this like medical avenue, because Ukraine in 2014 has undertaken what some medical anthropologists has referred to as really one of the like most ambitious reforms in healthcare, at least in Europe. And one of the aspects of this reform entails some changes into how HIV services are distributed. And there are also some changes as to whether international donors would be continuing to provide money and help to Ukraine in help to combat the HIV epidemic. And just I should mention that Ukraine, after Russia, Ukraine is the second biggest and the fastest growing HIV epidemic in the post-Soviet region. So basically there is this question of international donors and whether they will stay or whether they will go. And if they withdraw as they plan now, will the state be able to continue to provide HIV services to vulnerable groups? So basically, this is the avenue that I want to take now, and I also want to see how those changes and the in the medical sphere, in the medical bureaucracy, so to speak, how they impacted vulnerable groups like sex workers. So please keep the fingers crossed that COVID pandemic will end sometime soon, and I will be able to go and do my research.
Exactly. I'm very excited for the pandemic to be over. Awesome. Well, Daphna, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time and sharing all of your research. It was very insightful, and I will be in touch with you very soon to chat more.
Thank you so much, and have an awesome day, everyone.
You too. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.